The following is part of Cornell Contemporary China Initiative Lecture Series under the Cornell East Asia program. The arguments and viewpoints of this talk belong solely to the speaker. We hope you enjoy.
Welcome everybody back to the Cornell Contemporary China Initiative for April 15th, 2019. Tonight we're very happy to welcome Zhang Taisu, an associate professor of law at Yale University Law School in mid-promotion, or newly promoted. And a member of the global faculty at the Peking University School of Law. He's a comparative legal historian working between China and Europe, and his research centers around economic and property law, especially the origins of those laws in the early modern period. He's also a public intellectual, which is how I first came to know his work. His commentaries appeared at Foreign Policy, at China File, at Tea Leaf Nation. He's a current public intellectuals project fellow at the Committee on U.S.-China Relations. And as I just found out today, has interned at the Supreme People's Court of China, which maybe we'll get him to talk about later during the Q&A. We're very happy to have him, and let's give him a warm welcome.
Right. Well, so thank you, Nick, for the introduction and for the invitation. Let me start off by, I guess, explaining to you guys why you're stuck listening to a lecture on Qing history, despite the fact that this is actually kind of like a contemporary China series. I think the honest answer is I just kind of messed up. I didn't really notice this was called the Cornell Contemporary China Initiative until it was a little bit too late to actually change the topic. So Nick kindly pointed this out to me last week, and I think the way that I'm going to try to salvage this is by explaining to you guys over the course of the lecture why even if you have absolutely no general interest in Chinese history whatsoever, as long as you have some interest in some core features of the current Chinese state and economic system, you should still care about this thing. This is, I think I'm going to be describing to you guys today pretty much one of the single most important episodes in modern Chinese history, and one that has pretty much foundational impact on the way the entire Chinese state economic system currently functions, and frankly has been functioning for pretty much the past 40, 50 years. Now, actually, let me start just on that point, because I think that this will help you guys stay awake during the entire historical section. As you guys probably know by this point, given your interest in China, China has an unusually kind of statist economic system, right? So even after 1978, when we had this so-called opening up phase, and we supposedly transitioned away from a full-blown planned economy to kind of like a, what in Chinese lingo, a market economy with Chinese characteristics, or kind of like a socialist market economy with Chinese characteristics. It is still nonetheless true all the way up to now, and the trends actually seem to be getting more distinct in the pro-statist direction. That the state has always been pretty much at the center, at the center of the way the economy runs. Or even when we say we want an economic, we want some kind of market economy, our state still plays a pretty large coordinating and policymaking role in that kind of market economy that virtually no other state of this scale tends to play. You guys might think of the American government as relatively interventionist and sometimes pretty active in American policy, in economic policy making. Well, compared to China, it doesn't do nearly as much. Now, the easy way to understand all of this, the kind of cheap and easy way to say, to understand all of this, is to say, this is just this is like a natural consequence of China being like a nominally communist or a socialist state, right? Now, communist and socialist states naturally have more governmental involvement in the way the economy is run. Now, the thing is, that might seem tempting to a large extent, and that is probably also partially true, at least to some historical extent. But the thing is, well before the Chinese state became, communist in 1949, it had always been very, ever since 1900 or something around that time. The distinct characteristic of the Chinese economy was the state envisioned itself playing a hugely active role in it. And the size of the Chinese state relative to the economy that's running, basically the size of the state vis-a-vis the GDP of the economy, has been on this pretty much continuously upward path for basically the entire 20th century, and continuing nowadays even now. So essentially, the statist tradition of the Chinese economy, right, this like state-centered, management-oriented economic policymaking, did not really start with the PRC. In fact, the PRC basically took on a large number of like institutional elements that were passed down onto it by the previous nationalist governments in the Republican era. So essentially, like if you really want to trace the origins of this like relatively statist view of the economy, you have to go all the way back, probably to like the late 19th century, and to at least the early 20th century. Now, the argument that I'm going to present to you guys today is that basically all of this was a backlash, or at least like back in the early 20th century, it was pretty much a backlash against what was probably one of the most unusual phases in Chinese state building and economic regulation across China's 3,000-year history, right? So, we tend to, the common view of Chinese history pre-1912 is that it's like a series of cyclical dynasties, right? You guys have probably heard this, the dynastic view of Chinese history. It's pretty much like one dynasty after the other, and like most dynasties seem to resemble each other, seem to resemble one another in terms of how they look, right? They have like a similar government system, they have a similar legal system. They're technologically, to the uninitiated, it probably seems pretty similar from something like 800 AD all the way to 1900. It was, the notion is that China, whereas the West, after something like 1400, 1500, after the Black Death, the West was on kind of like an upward trend. You go from relatively undeveloped to highly developed over the course of a few centuries. Chinese history until 1912 moved in circles. Right, you would have a dynasty come into power, grow rapidly, become really powerful and influential and wealthy. You start to have crises in mid-dynasty. It would, eventually crumble under its own weight. And by the end, what you basically have is a political system in shambles. Now that triggers political collapse. There's a new dynasty that replaces it, and things go in circles. Right. Now the argument that I want to make is that may well be true on the dimensions that I care about today, which is basically I'm going to talk to you guys about fiscal policymaking. You guys may not care so much about taxes right now, but trust me, like once you actually start working for a living, once you get past your student phase, you're going to care a lot about your tax policies. So the claim basically is that the fiscal policy of these various Chinese dynasties is pretty much like at the core of what actually determines their relationship vis-a-vis the economy, and also what determines like how the economy actually functions. And then the argument is that China's very last dynasty, before 1912, before this like massive revolutionary phase, which is the Qing dynasty, was distinctly different from pretty much every previous dynasty that had come before it. And also the unusual tendencies of the Qing dynasty in terms of fiscal policymaking pretty much like laid the groundwork for the intellectual and political backlash that happened after 1912, which then led to the current shape of the Chinese party state and the overall Chinese state, the state-run economy that you actually see nowadays in China. Okay. So let me begin by basically giving you a sense of like what Qing fiscal policymaking was all about. Right. Now, pretty much every single human society before like the early 20th century, insofar as fiscal policymaking, the fiscal apparatus that you're talking about, like where the taxes come from, is pretty much a kind of like agrarian fiscal policy, right? The number one source of income is always you tax land, you tax peasants, you tax agriculture, and you use that money to fund other things. Okay, now the thing is, right, like, I don't know how many people are actually from China in this audience, but like if you are from China and you went through the Chinese high school system like I did, right? The conventional Chinese understanding of Chinese fiscal policymaking was that the vast majority of Chinese dynasties were bloodsuckers, right? They wanted to suck every little bit of blood from the peasants as they could possibly manage. And usually because of that, what usually caused their eventual collapse at the end of the dynasty was they taxed the peasants too heavily, and the tax would rise up in revolt and eventually kill off the dynasty. Now, that is all false. But let me explain to you why it's false and how that helps you understand like why the Qing was so unusual. Now, it is generally true of all previous Chinese dynasties up until the Qing that starting from around mid-dynasty, the weight of their fiscal extraction, right, like how many taxes you actually charge your population, starts to grow at a pretty rapid pace. Now, the reason for this, generally speaking, is you can kind of understand this in a very kind of like simple Malthusian cycle. Usually, a dynasty comes into power after a period of turbulence and chaos. After a civil war, that usually means the population is very low at the start of the dynasty because usually 30% or more of the population has been killed off in the previous couple of decades of turmoil. When the dynasty comes into power, it enforces stability, it calms everything down. The economy starts to grow again. People start having kids in greater numbers, and eventually, by mid-dynasty, right, the population and the economy grow to a much larger scope than what it was at the start of the dynasty. Now, this has been true of every single regime in Chinese history, including the PRC, right? Around mid-dynasty, because you are now facing a much larger population to govern, you tend to come to the realization that your previous bureaucracy is usually not going to be large enough, right? So you're going to want to expand the bureaucracy. Now, if you want to expand the bureaucracy, you got to pay for the bureaucrats. If you want to pay for the bureaucrats, you have to expand taxes. And because up until like 1912, all the previous dynasties were predominantly agricultural in economic characteristic, when you say raise taxes, you mean raising taxes on peasants. Now, this actually does not usually kill off the dynasty because, for the most part, the peasants weren't taxed that brutally even after the tax hike. But it is generally true of all previous Chinese dynasties, and it is generally true of pretty much every other comparative regime in human history, that somewhere in the middle of their existence, they tend to raise taxes on peasants. Right? This is true of every Chinese dynasty. It's true of the French, the Germans. If you look across the entire world in the early modern era, right, this period up until 1700, 1800, this entire 300 years during which the world was first beginning to industrialize and international commerce was first a thing, global connections were first made between Europe and various parts of Asia and the New World and so on and so forth. Around this entire period, like, for the most part, in terms of fiscal policy making, every single state is kind of expansionist, right? Like the states, because of the growth in population, the expansion of the economy, they have a pretty reasonably strong incentive to make themselves larger so that they can actually keep up with the economy and the population they're governing. Now, in this context, right, the Qing dynasty, which is this like Manchu-run dynasty that governed China from 1644 to 1912, and this is China's last imperial dynasty, was pretty much an extreme outlier, right? So generally speaking, like I think the common historical perception of Chinese governance pre-1900 or perhaps even pre-1949 was, or at least the version of it that the Communist Party really wants to sell people, is that it was unusually expressive. It was unusually kind of like, it was unusually brutal. It was very oppressive. It was like large and governing. But it was the kind of like nearly totalitarian state that a Republican government would justifiably rise up against and try to overthrow. Now, the thing about the Qing is nothing could be further from the truth when it came to this one dynasty. You may say, like, the totalitarian, authoritarian label, the kind of expansionist label, the heavy governance label may apply to virtually every previous Chinese dynasty except the Qing. But the Qing was pretty much like a unique governmental system in human history. And to illustrate this, let me give you two kinds of comparisons. One is horizontal. Compare the Qing with its peers, roughly at the same point in time, comparing with other kinds of governments in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. And the second is vertical. As a matter of horizontal comparisons, if you looked in something like 1850 at the size of the state relative to the size of the economy and the population it governed, the basic measure that you have of this, for example, would be something like like the government's tax income every single year relative to the GDP, right? So just as a basic curiosity, how many of you guys know like how much of your taxes, like how much of your income the U.S. government taxes every single year? Like what's the total ratio of the U.S. government's fiscal intake vis-a-vis the overall size of the American economy? Anyone know this? Guesses?
14%.
35%? That's pretty close, right? It's around 40%, right? For European governments, it's more like 50%. And that's what a modern state looks like. In the pre-modern phase, states were, of course, much smaller, right? Because they didn't have the, the technological apparatus to actually like collect that higher tax level. But that said, right, most governments were reasonably sized vis-a-vis their population. So England at this point in time collected roughly 25% of GDP. Japan collected something like 20 to 25%. Continental European powers were usually between 10 to 15%. Large land-based Asian empires were somewhat smaller than that, but usually they were still between 5 to 10%. Right. So that's the kind of like norm for early modern states, right? The larger you are, the more land-based you are, the ratio of the government vis-a-vis the economy shrinks a little bit, but it still stays above 5%. It usually goes up to as high as 10 in the vast majority of cases. All right. Now, up until the Qing, every other Chinese dynasty had always kind of like basically had always also kind of like fell into that kind of box, right? So the Ming was roughly like a 10% state. The Sung was like a 20% state. The Tang before that was like a 10 to 15% state. So, you know, in line with pretty much every other early modern or kind of like pre-modern empire or state that you could actually find in human history that was about as large and sophisticated to be kind of like a reasonable comparison to the Chinese state. All right. So compared against all of that, right, the Qing is this extreme outlier. After 1800, basically the size of the Chinese state in terms of how much taxes it collected vis-a-vis the economy was basically 1%. Now, wrap your heads around that for a moment. I'm a comparativist, and I study all kinds of historical societies. I do not know of a single other society where the tax rate was that low. And not only is it that low, it's dramatically lower than pretty much every other state that you can actually find in human history. So this in fact is the major characteristic of the pre-1912 Chinese state. It was the complete opposite of like the usual Chinese communist discourse about like some kind of like large, oppressive, expansionist, totalitarian imperial state. Rather, the main characteristic and problem with the Qing state was that it basically did not exist. But if you lived in a Chinese locality, if you lived in a county in the middle of China, you basically couldn't feel the government's presence at all in your daily life. Everything was more or less regulated by local lineages, social groups, guilds, all kinds of commercial organizations. It was self-governance by local social groups for the most part. The state, I mean, it existed, right? There was a county magistrate, there was a court that you could use to sue and settle disputes. But for the most part, apart from the government coming in every single year and asking for like 1% of your income as their fiscal intake, you didn't see these guys at all, right? And you might think that sounds great, right? Like God knows most of us, especially after I started having an actual job, I've really come to appreciate lower taxes. But trust me, like 1% taxes is insane. It basically means the government is completely non-functional. From everything from like military expenditures to economic regulation to any kind of industrial policy, right? So now that means that you have like the perfect laissez-faire, completely decentralized, not completely, but like almost completely decentralized economy in the Qing economy, right? Like it's probably the best example of a non-centrally regulated economy that you can get not only in Chinese history, but I'm pretty willing to bet across human history as well. All right. Now again, that sounds kind of great if you're like a full-blown capitalist, but the problem is that again, like everybody knows markets can fail, and there are all kinds of like collective action problems. There are transaction cost problems with economies and so on and so forth. And if you let an economy completely run without governmental intervention, there are going to be certain kinds of problems, right? And the major problem that I care about in my research, is industrialization, right? Now, it turns out that industrialization, that kind of like massive technological leap you make from kind of like a largely human labor-based pre-industrial economy to a kind of like a machine-based post-industrial economy, that's the kind of thing that usually takes very large amounts of kind of like in our economic historian lingo we call it capital accumulation. Now, capital accumulation basically means what you really need for a country to industrialize, for an economy to industrialize, is that you need the major economic players in that economy, whether it's large entrepreneurs, businessmen, or sometimes the state, to have tons and tons of capital to actually invest in these new technologies. Right? The reason why you need this is that most of these technologies, the steam engine, the spinning wheel, and so on and so forth, were not actually cost effective, especially in their earlier phases, unless you could actually invest in them at very large scales. Right? The steam engine is the perfect example of this. If you only have one engine and doing some kind of thing, it's usually much more cost effective to just buy oxen or have human beings do the job. The only cases in which it's actually cost effective to have steam engines do certain kinds of jobs for you is when the job is of a sufficiently large scale that employing that many human beings would not be terribly effective. So essentially, industrialization is the kind of thing that takes a ton of capital accumulation. Now, the thing is, one of the single most important sources of capital accumulation usually is the state. Right? Now, it is possible for you to get capital accumulation through other means, and much of my other work is involved in explaining why the Chinese economy could not have that kind of privatized capital accumulation. But there are plenty of societies in the world that basically industrialize because of aggressive state investment. So the perfect example, the paradigmatic example of this are two countries, Germany and Japan. Right? These are the two, in terms of success stories vis-a-vis industrialization, these are the two probably most successful examples of industrialization process that you can actually find in modern history. They expanded the fastest. Their economic standing across all countries in the world grew most rapidly over the shortest period. Both of those countries, the process was driven by governmental investment. Right? Now, China tried to industrialize at about pretty much the same time as Japan did. Right? Those of you who know some Chinese history will know that China and Japan entered into an arms race around 1860. And they were aware of each other's attempts to industrialize and build a modern military. So it really was kind of like a parallel arms race between those two countries. Now, of course, everybody knows Japan won by a huge amount, and it smashed the Chinese Navy and military in a series of wars in the 1890s, and then eventually it got so powerful that basically it colonized half of China during World War II. Right? But the foundation of all of that, right, the major cause for why the Japanese economy was able to industrialize so much faster than the Chinese economy was the Japanese state had, even in absolute terms, something like 3 to 4 times the actual kind of fiscal capacity of the Chinese state. And in terms of per capita terms, it had roughly 25 times the capacity of the Chinese state. So in terms of how much money you could actually spend on industrial policy making, on investments, on banks, on factories, just in absolute terms, despite the fact that the Japanese economy started off being only 1/3 of the size of the Chinese economy, the amount of money the Japanese government had at its disposal to actually throw into industrialization was something like 5 to 6 times larger than the Chinese government. Now, unsurprisingly, because of that kind of stuff, you win the arms race, right? So the reason why you care about the size of the state in this kind of context is in the context of industrialization. In this early modern global arms race that eventually decided the shape of the modern world, having a powerful state really matters, okay? Now, so in that general context, the fact that the Chinese state, the Qing state, was so much smaller than all of its peers, all of its predecessors in Chinese history, was a massive problem. Okay, so this is one of the single most important problems in pretty much all of Chinese history, and it's one of the most foundational things you have to look at if you want to understand how China came to be what it is right now. Because the starting point for modern Chinese history, why you have an anti-imperial backlash after 1912, why you have a communist revolution, is this overwhelming perception of Chinese weakness vis-a-vis Western powers, vis-a-vis Japan, and et cetera, et cetera. And all of that, to a very large extent, starts with the fact that the Chinese state was too small. So the question then is, why was the Chinese state too small? Now, this is the part that's kind of completely historical, and I don't want to bore you guys too much with the details. So let me give you probably a 5 to 10 minute bare bones explanation. So, very often historians, when faced with this problem, say, of course the Chinese state didn't tax too heavily, right? It's Confucian. Now, I don't know how much you guys know about Confucianism, but there's a common perception that Confucian states are states that have this like innate moral anxiety towards like some kind of like innate moral suspicion of taxation. It starts out with Confucius himself, who basically at one point basically said that the gentleman, the truly morally upright person, is not the kind of person that talks about material profit, right? 君子不言利. So if you believe in that, right, then a morally just person must not pursue material gain. Now this leads to all kinds of possible interpretations, including this like very long-standing argument in Chinese history about whether Confucian states were tolerant of merchant behavior or commercialization. And the argument was that because Confucius said that the morally upright gentleman does not speak of material profit, any person who pursues commercial profit has to be basically an asshole, right? That led to low social status for merchants and so on and so forth. And that's one of the things people point to for saying like this is why the Chinese economy fell behind. Now that turns out not to be true. Like the position of like merchants in Chinese society was perfectly high for most of Chinese history, and especially in the later stages. But what was true was that like most Chinese bureaucrats and Chinese officials throughout Chinese imperial history, when you ask them like what's your position vis-a-vis taxation, they'll kind of at least make a show of saying, I'm not morally comfortable with this. I think the morally just state should be a state that taxes as lightly as it can. And it's not morally good for you to tax too heavily because of all these things that Confucius once said. Now, that seems pretty intuitive, and that kind of thing seems to feed into an explanation for why the Qing state was so small. It couldn't tax because it was Confucian, and Confucian states have a tendency to under tax. Now, the problem with all that, of course, is the fact that Confucius said all this stuff did not stop any of the previous dynasties in Chinese history from growing taxes eventually. Right? Like when they really had to grow their tax base, they did so, and they might have like made a moral show of feeling bad about it. But basically, in the end, they were like, well, whatever, right? Like we have to have a larger tax base, we have to have more money, we have to have a larger military, we have to have more bureaucrats. Even if it's morally questionable to do all these things, we're going to do it anyway, right? Now, this is, I think, a general phenomenon in human history. I don't know how much faith you guys have in your bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. or in Albany or whatever. I really don't think there really has ever been a major historical example of moral norms really constraining governmental behavior when it comes to taxation, right? Bureaucrats are bureaucrats, right? Like they're pragmatic people who know what it takes, like what kinds of fiscal income levels it actually takes to run the government. And if you like starve yourself of taxation, not only is it against the government's interests, it's also against their personal interests. Against that kind of like really strong material incentive, basically no one really cares about morality all that much. Right? It's a sad thing, but like moral commandments have never stopped governments from raising taxes. So what was different about the Qing? Why was it why was it pretty much the only dynasty in Chinese history that once it set a kind of like a reasonably sustainable tax level around 1720, it stuck to that tax level for at least for peasants, for agriculture, it stuck to that tax level for the next 200 years. Without any growth, even in absolute terms, right? This is unprecedented. I don't know of a single other human example where the absolute volume of fiscal intake in some large state stays completely the same for that long. Usually, if you're a stable society, or even if you're a war-torn society, there usually will be some incentive for the government to raise taxes at some point. So like pretty much every other government raises taxes if you give them that long a time horizon. The Qing never raised taxes on agriculture. And that was what eventually killed off the dynasty and pretty much wrecked the Chinese economy. So the question is, why do you not do this? Well, it turns out that if you look at like the broader scope of Chinese history, okay, we talk all the time about peasant rebellions killing off Chinese dynasties. Every good Chinese person who has been through high school can rattle off like a series of major peasant rebellions that seem to end a lot of dynasties, right? Now, the interesting thing is, up until the Ming, not a single one of those peasant rebellions had actually killed off a dynasty before. Or they caused some trouble, but usually the elites of that dynasty usually had no trouble putting down those peasant rebellions. Okay, the Qing was different in that it came directly after pretty much the only Chinese state in imperial Chinese history to really be killed off by a peasant rebellion. The peasant rebellions at the end of the Ming were, they are the only example of a peasant rebellion sacking the capital, killing off the emperor, and basically come to the verge of basically completely establishing a new dynasty based off of a peasant rebellion. Right? None of the previous peasant rebellions ever came close to that. The one exception might be kind of like the rebellions against the Mongols at the end of Mongol rule. You guys may or may not care about this, but usually the conventional interpretation of that was not a peasant rebellion at all. That was like an ethnic Han uprising against the Mongol conquerors, and that had very little to do with how aggrieved the peasants actually felt. The only really major, in the consciousness of Chinese elites, of Chinese political elites, the late Ming peasant rebellions that started around 1630 and eventually killed off the dynasty in 1644 are the only example of a peasant rebellion really killing off a major dynasty. And let me put it this way, that kind of thing leaves intellectual scars that is simply unfathomable to people who haven't actually lived through that. So to kind of give you a modern equivalent, so this is the equivalent of the changes to modern Western political elites in terms of their ideological orientation or the way that they think about the world, the way they think about economic policy making, and the role of the state after something like World War II. Right? That was probably one of the more appropriate comparisons to how big a seismic shock this actually was. Up until that point, dynasties came and went, but the ruling elite itself never actually completely lost power to the peasants. Right? So the rulers could basically tell themselves that our policies basically work. The peasants may sometimes rebel, but it's basically controllable, and we can bring things back under control through some pretty tried and true methods, like expanding the military, giving off some kind of economic relief, making sure we have enough famine relief for the peasants. By this point, around 1600 in the later Ming, people were thinking, we have a pretty nice playbook for dealing with peasant rebellions. We kind of know how to manage them. Then the late Ming rebellions come along, they kill off the dynasty, and this completely shifts the way that elites think about peasants. Up to this point, you could talk mainly about tax policy, and you could talk about the state-peasant relationships, largely in the domain of morality. Right? You could say raising taxes was morally questionable, but it's not the kind of thing that we really think is likely to kill off the dynasty. It's not likely to be the kind of thing that fundamentally threatens the entire existence of us, the political elite. Now, that all changes after the end of the Ming, right? Because for the first time, you actually have a dynasty that's killed off by the peasants, and so right after the Ming collapse, during the Ming-Qing transition, governmental thinking about what the appropriate size of the state actually is completely changes, right? Instead of arguing that raising taxes is immoral anymore, for now, right now the overwhelming argument being presented by the elites is, well, actually, it's not that raising taxes is immoral anymore. We knew that it was immoral all along, but we're kind of willing to bear with the moral consequences as long as there was some other greater good to be gained. But now we have an actual example. We know for sure that given our current economy, if taxes go beyond a certain level, the peasants are going to rise up and kill us. And that triggers a massive sea change in the way that they deal with fiscal policy. Because again, morality is a constraint against governmental behavior, but it's kind of like a weak constraint, right? You can reason yourself out of moral problems all kinds of ways. You can, in your head engage in all kinds of dumb trolley problems to talk yourself out of pretty much any possible moral conundrum. You can't, when that kind of logic hardens into self-survival, the mental constraints become much harder, right? Saying that peasant rebellions are going to kill you if you raise taxes is a vastly stronger political constraint against governmental behavior than saying raising taxes are immoral, right? But honestly, I tend to think of this as just kind of innate human nature. When I tell my kids who are 7 and 5 that it's wrong for you to do X, 5 out of 10 times they might actually pay attention to me, but like I'm pretty lucky if like 2 out of 10 times they actually listen to me. Right? Moral persuasion works sometimes with toddlers, but usually it's like they'll think whatever. Daddy's ranting off about morality again. Who cares? That said, when I say do this and you will, go to your room for 20 minutes, that works so much better than saying do this and it's immoral. Now, of course, the best kind of parenting usually is the kind that uses both. You have to have a stick, and you have to have a kind of like a moral carrot, and you have to have a stick as well. But in this case, right, like only until the Qing did the stick actually really emerge in Chinese political thought. Up until then, it was only the moral carrot, and the moral carrot didn't really work for most of the Chinese history. Right? Now you have the stick, and all of a sudden governmental policy completely firms up. Now, the interesting thing in all of this is the historians, right? The interpretation of Ming collapse, which is, like the Ming collapse because it raised taxes too heavily on peasants, is actually kind of ridiculous, right? Because late Ming taxes, as far as we can tell, didn't really have much to do with peasant rebellions at all. Rather, the problem with the late Ming, the reason why you have so many peasant rebellions in the late Ming is actually the opposite. Right? So there was, because of this like little ice age, temperatures plummeted across the globe in the early 1600s. Because of that, because of climate change, right? Because of climate change, there were massive famines in northwestern China. The state at that point was so strapped of cash that it didn't have the resources to offer famine relief to peasants who were suffering because of the famines. Now, when peasants starve, they revolt and want to sack landlord households and want to sack estates to get food. The famine goes on long enough, they will want to sack governmental granaries to get grain and so on and so forth. So the real problem with the peasant rebellions actually was the complete opposite of the state taxing too heavily. Rather, the problem really was the state was taxing too little from non-famine stricken areas, so that it didn't have the cash to actually offer famine relief to the peasants. Which begs the question, right? If that was the case, which is what historians believe nowadays, why did Qing elites actually buy completely into the we raised taxes too heavily, therefore the peasants killed us off kind of narrative of late Ming collapse? Now, this is something that draws upon kind of like a branch of cognitive theory, kind of like a branch of psychology. I don't know if there are any psych majors in the audience today. Human beings tend to interpret facts according to their a priori normative worldview. Right? So the example of this is, for example, right? So there was an example a couple of years ago done by a bunch of people at Yale and Harvard. So if I had to tell you, I bring a bunch of right-wing Republicans and a bunch of left-wing Democrats, and I give them the same kind of information about climate change, based off of your intuitions, do you think that will make them come to move towards the middle, come to a consensus about climate change, or do you think it's going to make them more polarized? Just show of hands, how many of you think it's going to make them come to a consensus? I show them extensive, neutral, objective scientific research about climate change. How many people think that's going to generate political consensus on climate change? Okay, you guys are more jaded than I thought, but this is good. So the experiments show that if you show people with a priori biases against a certain kind of thing, information about that thing, they're not going to interpret the information neutrally. They're going to interpret the information in whatever way best conforms to their kind of normative or psychological priors. Right? So the thing about the Chinese elites in the late Ming period was they have a normative prior telling them taxation is morally bad. Right? So when a peasant rebellion comes along and kills off the dynasty, their natural inclination, given that kind of worldview, is to think finally the fates have caught up with us. Right? We were kind of tempting fate for so long by raising taxes, even though we knew it was morally bad, and now finally the peasants have come along to punish us. Right? When you have that kind of normative worldview lurking in the background, and something catastrophic happens that kind of semi-reasonably lends itself to a certain kind of empirical interpretation that reinforces your normative priors, most likely you're going to embrace that kind of interpretation. And that's exactly what happened in the Ming context, right? So because they had this kind of like normative prior that taxation was bad once the peasant rebellions came along, they completely bought into the narrative that was initially pitched by a couple of people that raising taxes killed off the previous dynasty. Okay? Now once they bought into that, and once the normative, the moral commandment becomes kind of like a pragmatic self-survival kind of command, self-survival kind of common sense, that's when the entire like behavioral foundations of the Qing political elite completely shift against taxation. And so for the next 230 years, you operate under kind of like a constant living fear of raising taxes too high, that the peasants are going to kill you off, right? So how does this finally come to an end at the end of the Qing? Well, at the end of the Qing, the state runs into extremely severe fiscal crisis for a number of reasons. Right? It keeps losing battles to foreign powers. There are, again, a number of other famines. But the main problem was losing battles to foreign powers, and also especially losing battles to the Japanese. Back then, if you lost a war against the foreign nation usually charged you like massive amounts of indemnities. You saw this in the Versailles Treaty after World War I, and that was arguably the main cause for the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany, right? So China got slapped with massive war indemnities that it owed to various kinds of foreign powers, Japan, England, France. And by 1900, because of all that, it had gone completely bankrupt. Now, once the state finally goes completely bankrupt, despite all this incredibly strong kind of like fear of peasant rebellion, it has to raise taxes no matter what. Otherwise, it's going to kill itself, right? So finally, it raises taxes. And guess what? Because it had kept the tax rate, the absolute volume of taxes completely unchanged, for 200 years, well, during that same period, the economy and the population are both pretty much like tripled. Right? Taxes were unprecedentedly low in Chinese history at this point in time. So if you raise taxes, well, I mean, the peasants won't care so much. Right? If you raise taxes from like 1% to, I don't know, 2%, well, yeah, they're going to grumble. But honestly, it's not that big a dent in their overall financial circumstances. So after 1900, when they're finally forced out of complete desperation to raise taxes, they finally discovered, oh my God, we can raise taxes and not have the peasants kill us. So that sets off a series of tax hikes, going past the end of the dynasty after 1912, going into the Republican era, going into the PRC, where the tax rate, the tax rate on agriculture goes from pretty much like 0.8% in 1900 all the way up to like 12, 13% in the early PRC, right? So once the government finally realizes that like contrary to this like dominant Qing political ideology of low taxes, we can actually raise taxes and not die from it. Once it realizes it can do that, it gets the taste of things and just never stops doing it all the way across most of modern Chinese history. Until, by the mid-20th century, China actually had by the mid-PRC, like by the 1960s, China actually had one of the most aggressive agricultural tax regimes in the entire world. Now, the interesting thing is, because of that raise in taxes, because of the fiscal surplus that brought to the Chinese state, China was actually finally able to industrialize in the 1950s and 60s. Right? So up until that point, you starve yourself of taxes, you treat your people leniently and nicely. You don't raise taxes, everything's fine. But you can't industrialize because the state's too small. Once you finally, after the early PRC, once the communist regime completely ditches all caution to the wind and thinks we're just going to tax the hell out of these peasants, we're going to tax them up to the point where they're nearly on the verge of breaking. We're going to like maximize their fiscal income. We're going to maximize the size of the state because we really want to industrialize. It turns out they can actually get away with that. And even despite the fact that that kind of policy was arguably partially responsible for massive peasant suffering during the Great Leap Forward and in the early PRC, like all kinds of like peasants famines in the early PRC, despite all of that, the peasants still don't rebel because honestly, rebellion is a hugely costly thing for peasants. Right? Like, why would you want to risk like a 50% chance of death in a rebellion when you have any reasonable shot of staying alive as the usual peasants? Right? Like, peasants don't rebel unless they're completely desperate. Right? So it turns out you can tax them really heavily. Once you do that, though, that finally gives the state the fiscal resources to industrialize. So that process, the discovery that you can actually tax and not die, the constant rewriting of like the elite perception of what is the fiscal limitation of the agrarian economy throughout the early 20th century, that entire process fundamentally changes the government's imagination of what role the state should actually play in the economy. Because throughout the entire Qing, because the state is constantly shrinking vis-a-vis the economy, it has no administrative capacity, it has very little economic capacity, the state basically plays no role. Right? The economy self-regulates. Everything's conducted pretty much on like a market-to-market basis. And because of that and a set of other reasons that we can talk about later, there is very little capital accumulation in the overall economy. Now, finally, once you start to change all that, once you start to more aggressively tax, the state has the fiscal resources to finally do something to the economy. And once it starts doing that and having some moderate success, even in the pre-PRC Republican area, of seeing returns to that, seeing the economy slowly begin to industrialize, seeing China kind of like slowly, not quite pull even, but pull closer to first world countries in terms of economic capacity, that fundamentally shifts the entire like policy orientation of Chinese elites. And so basically, like in much the same way that the Qing response to Ming collapse was never again, like never again will we raise taxes so aggressively. The Republican and PRC response to the Qing is also never again. Never again will we stick ourselves with that weak a state apparatus. Look what it gave us. It gave us a century of suffering. It gave us like multiple decades of humiliation and constant military defeats at the hands of foreign powers. Never again will we actually put ourselves through that. So, what do we do now? Like the path towards national prosperity, the path towards military power, the path towards modernization runs through the state. Right? The Chinese belief in the state, this incredibly strong Chinese elite belief in the state playing the major role in the economy, starts off in the early 20th century as a backlash against what they perceived to be Qing weakness. And it was actually pretty much, unlike the Ming perception, this was pretty much an accurate perception. The Qing had indeed suffered because of the weakness of its state. China's international standing had it plummeted and catered and completely caved because of the weakness of the Chinese state. And so once they start to finally realize this, the Chinese economy does start to take off a little bit again. But more importantly, as a matter of political ideology, it completely locks the Chinese elite for the next century or so in this mode of thinking that the state has to be king in the economy. And that precedes socialism, it precedes communism. It's a constant theme of the Chinese elite throughout the entire 20th century. It continues even today. Because honestly, right now, if you ask the Chinese government, honestly, Xi Jinping's policymakers, if you ask Liu He, how much do you actually believe in state planning? Well, no one really believes in like planned economies according to the socialist ideal, right? Like none of these guys are really socialist or communist in the way that they understand the economy. But at the same time, they remain completely committed to a statist notion of the economy, right? Which is why no matter what, to kind of like give you guys a sense of how this plays out in contemporary, like current affairs, right? It's like no matter what the Trump administration does, China is never going to give up its like industrial subsidies to firms. It's never going to give up a state-run, state-driven industrial policy. It's never going to it's never going to allow the Chinese economy to completely be a relatively unregulated market economy in the American or perhaps, I don't know, like Indian model. But like that belief in the prominence of the state, of the critical importance of the state to the economy is so deep in the Chinese elite political psyche that honestly it would take something catastrophic, perhaps like a deep, deep recession that might overthrow the party, to actually overturn that, right? So this is the way that like intellectual and political paradigms operate. So as a general matter, human political ideology is not continuous, right? You don't go, no matter what scholars want you to think, politics, ideology, your beliefs about how the world works as a matter of like general social and political belief, they don't operate in kind of like a continuous rational fashion, right? No one is constantly reassessing their beliefs based on empirical evidence, right? What tends to happen is there has to, like, the only way you get major paradigm shifts is through major crises. Ming collapse, right? The collapse of the Qing, like the collapse of the imperial system. It would take something of that scale to, some fundamental economic catastrophe, the likes of which we have not yet seen in modern Chinese history, to probably force the Chinese elites out of this like statist mode of thinking that they entered after the Qing collapse, right? And so that's, I think, like why you should care about this part of Chinese history, even if you don't really care about Chinese history in general, because this is the part of Chinese history that directly explains one of the deepest political instincts of the modern Chinese political elite when it comes to economic policy making, and when it comes to kind of designing the overall shape of the party state or the Chinese economy. Okay, so I hope I've at least like made a reasonable case of that to you guys. And for now, let's say we have, 35 minutes of questions? Okay, great. Thank you.